Hello. A big thank you to Mr. Chrétien to have joined us. Thank you all for coming. I will do something that will not please Mr. Chrétien. I will start by talking about him, only a few minutes. After that, I'll let him speak. The Right Honorable Jean Chrétien was born in Shawinigan, as everyone knows, on January 11th, 1934. A date predestined for someone who wants to become Prime Minister, because it is also the date of birth of John A. Macdonald, but not January 11th of the same year. He was born in 1885. Mr. Chrétien is the 18th child of Marie and Willie Chrétien. After studying law at Laval University, he practiced law in Shawinigan from 1958 to 1962, and at that time, he became director of the bar of Trois-Rivières. He was elected to the House of Commons for the first time in 1963 and will, if I'm not mistaken, be re-elected 12 times. He has held positions in an impressive number of departments: National Revenue, Indian Affairs and Northern Development, Treasury Board, Industry and Trade, Finance, Justice and Attorney General of Canada, Energy, Mines and Resources, External Affairs, Minister responsible for the Francophonie. Jean Chrétien was also leader of the official opposition from 1990 to 1993. He became Prime Minister on November 4th, 1993, and it is a position he held for 10 consecutive years until December 12th, 2003. Mr. Chrétien practices law since his retirement from active politics. He holds the Order of Merit of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth, the Companions of the Order of Canada, and has received 20 honorary doctorates from many universities located in 7 different countries. The Jean Chrétien Holding of Library and Archives Canada bears the romantic name of Holding R11344. It consists of 313 meters of textual documents, over 422,000 photos, 5,600 audio-visual records, maps, posters, and even buttons. We've seen a few at the entrance, and pins. This is a gold mine for researchers and students, a mine made up of over 40 deposits, which took place over the entire political career of Mr. Chrétien, up until 2003. The extent of his holding is such that it required a processing plan that took place over 3 years, from 2006 to 2009 in Shawinigan. 3 archivists of the LAC have regularly worked with him, and I would like to salute them and thank them. These 3 archivists are Lisa Tremblay-Goodyear, Elizabeth Mongrain, and Bruno Lemay, who are with us this afternoon. Mr. Chrétien, thank you very much for having accepted our invitation. I've mentioned 8 ministries where you have held positions between 1967 and 1984, and it is a very impressive list, but your first assignment was more modest. In 1965, you were Parliamentary Secretary to Lester B. Pearson. Under what circumstances you were appointed Parliamentary Secretary to Mr. Pearson?
Well, because he called me and said I was going to be his Parliamentary Secretary. It's not much more complicated than that. Why did he choose me? I don't know. Perhaps because some months before, Mr. Lesage, Mr. René Lévesque, who was the Minister of Lesage of Natural Resources, had asked to see me in Quebec. There was a by-election in the constituency of Saint-Maurice at provincial level, and he wanted me to fill the seat. Because my region was quite, except for the city of Shawinigan, it was rather national union. So he wanted to replace René Hamel, who was Minister of Justice. He wanted someone who was better known. And I went to see Lévesque in Quebec. He took me to see Lesage, and then Mr. Pearson had heard of my arrival through Maurice Sauvé, because René Lévesque had told Maurice Sauvé that someone will steal Chrétien. So he reported it to Pearson, and Pearson, Mr. Pearson, has asked me to see him. And then he told me, he has explained to me that it was very difficult for him at that time because he had problems with Quebec ministers. They were involved in, they have not been found guilty of anything, but it was a controversy. And the House of Commons at the time, the opposition was led by Diefenbaker. It was rather vicious. So he explained these problems, and then he asked me. Well, I said I didn't know what I would do. They made me an offer, and then at some point he asked, "Do you believe in Canada?" Obviously, he had hit the jackpot when he said that. So I answered, "Yes, and I will stay." And he said, "No, don't take such an important decision right away. Go. Take a week off. Stay home and think about it." We were in minority. He said he would find someone to vote in the chamber, to abstain if you were not here. In those days, we called that a father. So I went home. I consulted. On 20 or 21 people, there were 17 telling me to go to Quebec and 4 telling me to come to Ottawa, including Aline. She wanted to stay in Ottawa. So I stayed in Ottawa. And when I called him on Sunday night to inform him about my decision, he had another major problem. He was rather depressed, and he told me this was the only good news of the day, the only good news today. So this is how I stayed, and he appointed me a few weeks later as his parliamentary secretary.
What was your relationship like at that time with Pearson?
Well, it was a very good one. I sometimes say that my relationship with him was a sporty one. Mr. Pearson wanted to be a professional baseball player, not to become prime minister. That's what he told me one day. And then, when he became head of government, he said, "There is a softball game on Parliament Hill between MPs and journalists. Charlie Lynch was the coach of the journalists. Do you remember the older ones? Charlie Lynch and Pearson were the coaches of the MPs. And as I was rather young, it was me who was the pitcher for the deputies. And we've won. So this is where I won my seat in the cabinet." And he brought me to campaign in his county in 1965, a few months after. And because there were francophones in Algoma, I went there to campaign with him at that time.
Pierre Trudeau, how did you feel? He was your colleague, and then...
Well, Trudeau, no. I was elected before him, but I let him go first because he was older than me. But no, he was elected in 1965, and there was a problem. What happened is that when I went to the Algoma constituency with Mr. Pearson, it's there that he told me he went to find Jean Marchand, who was the great man of the Quebec unions, Gerard Pelletier and Trudeau. I said, Marchand, it's a good idea. Pelletier, that's an excellent idea. But Trudeau, we'll never be able to get him elected. This guy, nowhere. He was pretty aggressive when it was on TV, and he was rather independent. He didn't like the Liberals. And while I was watching him on TV, I told Pearson, we will have a hard time getting him elected. And in fact, it was difficult, because he wanted Outremont. He wanted to go to a French county, and we didn't find any. He was elected in Mount Royal, and because he was very aggressive, but he learned quickly. So we became colleagues, and he was elected in 1965. And from the first caucus, we chose a caucus chair, and at the time, the party was divided between the old guard and the new guard. Obviously, I was among the new guard, and Jean Marchand had told me it would be preferable for a guy from the new guard to become the caucus chair. So they chose Gerard Lenil from Valleyfield, and there was Pitt Lessard, who was the candidate, I think, on the other side. And then when the time of the vote came, the result was equal. And the caucus chair voted. I believe he also voted for Pitt Lessard. And there, Lenil lost. And then me, who hates losing elections, I had just lost an election. There was a guy who had not voted. His name was Trudeau. I went to see him and I asked, "Why didn't you vote?" "Well," he said, "I knew neither of them." "Well, okay." But I said, "Listen, it was about the old guard and the new guard." He says, "I know nothing about the old guard, the new guard." "Really?" So I explained to him, "It is me who suggested the application to Marchand." "Yes," he said, "and someone else suggested another." I said, "You'd better learn fast because you won't go very far in politics." He has learned quickly, obviously.
What kind of boss was he? What was your professional relationship like?
Excellent. It was excellent. We never had any problems. He seemed to trust me, and when he had problems, he just changed departments. I have changed a few times, as you have seen. I have worked in 8 to 9. When there were too many problems, the first time we used a more colorful word there. He said, "Chrétien, take the shovel," and, well, it gave me the opportunity to know the government more in depth. All the time I was his minister, he always gave me tough positions, and it was very difficult for him because I never wanted to change. And I told him, well, that I was scared. Go, go, go. We had a very good relationship, and I've been sitting for a long time next to him in the House of Commons. But it was a man who was very reserved. There were never small or easy conversations with him. It always stayed very serious.
What was the degree of control he had over the degree of control of the Prime Minister over his ministers at that time?
Well, he didn't like to control everything. And one day, I was Minister of Indian Affairs. He called me and he wanted the ministers to do their jobs. He called me and he said, "Jean, it's been a year since you didn't talk to me." Well, I said. He said, "Are you angry at me?" I said, "No." Well, I said, "We use the informal tu between us. And when there was a third person present, I used to call him Prime Minister. So I said, I don't want to disturb you. You've got work to do, and I'm doing my job." And I added, "Since you don't call me, well, it actually suits me because I don't want you to call me." And there he said, "If they were all like you, it would be so easy to be Prime Minister." So this proved that he liked delegating, and the Department of Indian Affairs and Northern Development was very controversial at the time. You know, there was nothing. All the public servants of the reserves that existed, there was one official who was the leader, who was the absolute master. The Indian organizations and all that didn't exist at the time, and well, I survived. And he told many people he was wondering how I was able to survive. He was sitting next to Mitchell Sharp in the House. Mitchell was my mentor. People were telling me on the sly, as we say. They were telling me the comments of Trudeau. He was a little surprised that I was succeeding like that. And developing after 4 years. He wanted to move me, and then he moved a lot of people. It was the cabinet reshuffle. And when he asked the Indians, he's informed Dieter Walter, who was from Saskatchewan, who was the president of the National Association of Indians. He said, "I will replace Chrétien." Walter Dieter said, "No, we prefer to keep him." He was very surprised. So when I met with the Indian chiefs later, I asked them, "Hey, what happened? You are constantly whining against me. Then you want to keep me?" So they kindly said to me, "We prefer to deal with the devil we know than the devil we don't know." So Trudeau kept me there until he appointed me president of the Treasury Board. Well, he trusted me, I guess.
Of course, we will discuss the different issues that have interested and motivated you, but I want to make a slight detour. I also want to hear about other leaders that you've met during your time as Prime Minister. I will do it speed dating style. I will name a few, and you will have to describe them to me. How you saw them, tell us a little bit about your relationship with them or the important issues that you've shared. For example, Bill Clinton.
Well, we were friends, Bill Clinton and I. It came naturally. He came from the United States. And he and Hillary were very interested in what we were doing in Canada. He would always question me about our health system, how I could survive in politics by being against the death penalty. He inquired about firearms control, abortion. They were intrigued because it created major problems in the States, while we in Canada, we had managed to deal with it. Like in my case, in my constituency, everyone was for the death penalty, and I voted against the death penalty. I have voted that the women should have the choice to dispose of their bodies as they wished, to decide if they want abortion or not. But obviously, it was a very Catholic environment. In my area, there were 40 sisters. For the election after, they had received orders to vote against me. 38 voted against me, and 2 refused to vote. This was the background of the time. In firearms, it was a similar situation because we have a lot of hunting in our region, in Mauricie. There were issues like that, and Bill was interested, and he was very kind. I'll feel your pain. He was extremely kind, and he loved to discuss. He wanted to convince you, but it always took a lot of time. Aside from that, he was always late. And for me, who was always on time, well, I had a bit of trouble accepting that. I am always on time. My father used to say that punctuality is a virtue of kings. So he was always late. And Hillary, she was very nice. After having talked to Bill, I asked her how her daughter was. She asked about my children, and right after that question, the subject came back to policies, to what we do in Canada. They were great fans. They were considered moderate in the United States. Politically, they were situated rather in the center than the right or left. Clinton once said, "Chrétien does third way at best," because, the third way was the third approach, the third path. We had a progressist meeting. He would call it a meeting with prime ministers. There was Bill Clinton, Tony Blair, Schroeder, and all. Then we met with the Swedes and all. But every time we mention the third way, it's Chrétien in Canada who does it best. Or not even Chrétien, but the Canadians who are the most successful doing it. So it was very, very nice. And we played golf together every once in a while.
Oh, really?
Well, yeah.
Is there any particular dossier that led you to work with him?
No. Well, we always have dossiers with them. The first day I saw him was at the summit of APEC in Seattle, I think. And he was, I said, "I don't want to be too close to you." He was a little surprised to hear that. Mulroney loved being close to the U.S. president. So I told him, if I keep my independence, and I don't become the 51st state of the United States, I can do things for you that even the CIA cannot do. So we were good friends. Moreover, he has said it regarding my book. He has made very, very kind remarks.
Nelson Mandela.
Well, Nelson Mandela was a god for people who believed in democracy. The first time we have met him, we were in New Zealand at the Commonwealth Summit, and all the heads of state were there at this beautiful location on November 11th. But only one person existed. There was a huge crowd. Everyone wanted to touch Mandela. It was 1995. People were crying and everything. It was an emotional day. It was November 11th, Remembrance Day. He was very, very, very nice. We had a few dinners alone with him, and Aline remembers it with great emotion. The first time we had dinner with him and his wife, it was very nice, and so was his wife. So we had dinner once, and my son Hubert, who cares for the disabled and gives them scuba diving training and all. I spent the whole dinner talking about scuba diving with Mandela. Mandela was living on his island, and they were both doing, it's called apnea. They can keep their breath for a long time. So both could do this for 5 minutes. My son did this in front of me. I got scared. I thought he was dead in the water. So they talked about it, and he told us stories. He said that when he came out of prison, when he was in prison, he was allowed to dive. So he began to search for a renowned fish species. He was catching them in deep waters. So if he caught 10 fish, he was allowed to keep 2, and the guards would take the other 8. So he said he did that the whole time he was in prison, and he ate a whole lot of fish. When he got out of prison, to honor him, they served him this kind of rare and highly sought fish. He was so disgusted to eat it. So that was the kind of man he was.
Did he have a real appreciation towards Canada?
Yes. He knew we were under Mr. Trudeau at the beginning, but Mr. Mulroney had worked for, and it was more difficult for Mulroney because he was against Mrs. Thatcher, and also probably against Reagan in this dossier. So it was more complicated. And then, well, I have been made an honorary citizen of Canada. When I left, he sent me a message because he said I would not have. He said, "I regret that you are taking your retirement. I will not have the opportunity to vote for you."
You were close to Jacques Chirac as well.
Yes, not in the beginning, but we quickly found a way to get along.
What happened in the beginning?
Although he had some ambiguous statements on the referendum of 1995, well, when we saw each other after that, it was rather complicated. Because, I was very embarrassed. So I told him straight up what I was thinking, a bit abruptly. And this is, he said, his great friend was Jean Peltier, who was my chief of staff. Mr. Peltier had been mayor of Quebec when he was mayor of Paris. Then, at a certain point, Chirac found himself in a political vacuum, so he was mayor of Paris. But he was not on the national scene anymore. He wanted to remain at an international level. He has founded the Association of Francophone Mayors with Peltier. So he was president, while Peltier was secretary. They were great friends. So he said he was rather surprised at my statement. I told him, "You would not want me to come and shout, 'Vive la Corse libre.'" He would not have found it funny, but
after that, did it? After this?
We became great friends. He came to the north of Canada. He went to visit a primitive art museum. And we've helped him to find, he was looking for ancient Indian and native artifacts.
Yes, from British Columbia in particular.
There are a few in the north as well. When he visited the north, he had been briefed by someone who knew the language, and he had managed to learn a few words in Eskimo when he came with me. Well, that was nice. He enjoyed it too. He has loved it. But the funny thing is that in the evening, Aline and him, Aline, Bernadette, we had dinner all together. And I told him, "Look at this. This belongs to Canada. I am Canadian, and I'm from Quebec. I'm not about to let this go. I want to keep it all to myself." He smiled. By chance, it was the most beautiful night to watch the aurora borealis. The sky was dancing that night, and we walked out to see it. I said, "Jacques, the temperature is under federal jurisdiction. I organized this just for you tonight."
Is that true that it was him who encouraged or inspired you to create your museum in Shawinigan?
Yes. For my museum in Shawinigan, he told me that he had a museum in his town. So I went to see it in where he originally comes from. It's in the center. I forgot the name of the city. It is a beautiful museum. That's what gave me the idea. So I went to see it. Well, and then I had the idea to collect all the gifts I had received during, well, actually, I say my gifts, but most of them are Aline's gifts, because she received more gifts than me. We had 800 or 900 in total, so we agreed, Aline and I, that 900 gifts in the living room created a lot of dust. We have decided to place them in the city of Shawinigan, who created an extraordinary museum with it. I invite people to go and visit it. It's really worth it.
What about Queen Elizabeth?
Well, Queen Elizabeth has always been... I was introduced to her in 1967 at the Montreal Expo. And I got to know her better in 1970, when I became Minister of Northern Affairs. She came to visit the North. Aline and I were the hosts in the North for 4 days. The Queen and Prince Charles do not travel in the same plane. And we had planes that were the very small ones. I was on a plane with the Queen and Prince Philip. Aline was with Prince Charles and Princess Anne in the other plane. The Queen traveled with me. We spent hours in a twin otter going from one village to the next. And there she was, speaking to me in French. She probably couldn't stand my English, but that's another problem. So we spoke in French for a long time. We knew each other pretty well. And we saw her again for several occasions. When the Olympics happened, I was responsible for the Federal Olympics in Montreal because Mr. Trudeau asked me to. It was a terrible task. You know, the Olympics had been held in Germany before that, in the capital.
Munich.
In Munich. There had been a lot of unrest. There was violence. Then Trudeau told me that he wanted to have a minister on the spot just in case. Can you imagine? I was forced to spend the whole week at the Olympics with the very best tickets. I had the opportunity to meet the Queen again. I was the responsible minister of the North. I have a very funny story with the Queen. When she came here, we were finishing our day in Fort Providence, where they have unveiled a monument erected for Mackenzie, who has discovered the Mackenzie River. And then there were thousands of people. And at the end of the ceremony, the Master of Ceremonies was supposed to sing "O Canada," but he was too embarrassed, poor man. So what can I do? Duty calls, and I get up. I walk to the front to sing "O Canada," but I have a terrible voice. And then I start singing "O Canada," but I sing "O Canada" in French only. Nobody came with me. I was solo. Everyone was laughing. My wife said she has never been so embarrassed in her life. When I went back to my seat, I said, "Your Majesty, there are very few Canadians who have the privilege to be the soloist for the royal family." So, a few months later, Prince Charles comes to Ottawa, and he recognizes me. He asks me, "How are you, Mr. Chrétien?" I said, "Your Royal Highness, how come you recognize me? We were many ministers at the event." His answer was, "Oh, you singing the national anthem in the North. It's now part of the royal folklore."
So let's talk about the great moments of your career. There are many. I've chosen a few. One was the adoption of the Convention on the Prohibition of Anti-Personnel Mines in December 1997. Under what circumstances did you become the champion of this cause?
Well, I had just been appointed Prime Minister, and Jim Battleman, who was my international advisor, who was an official, a former ambassador, told me that the president of the Red Cross, who was in Ottawa, would like to see me. And then he would like to discuss a particular problem with you. So he came to see me, and he told me about landmines. It must have been around 1995. And this is how I started to be interested in the subject. We started the work with Mr. Ouellette, who was my foreign minister. Then Lloyd Axworthy came and continued our work. He has worked very hard. And then I called the heads of state to sign the convention, the Ottawa Treaty, here. I had to call them to. We made more than 120 countries sign, and I almost succeeded in making the Americans sign. But Bill, I spent the whole night on the phone discussing with Bill Clinton. He wanted to sign it, but the chief of staff refused, so he couldn't sign it. Yeltsin promised me that if Clinton signed, he would sign too. Anyway, I could talk about this for ages. It was a dossier that gave me a lot of satisfaction, because every year we could read in the newspapers that young people exploded in the fields. They were killed or lost an arm, a leg, and all. So we invested a lot of money in this cause. All the mines that were lost in almost every country have been collected since then. Almost 140 countries have signed the Ottawa Treaty, so...
But why does the Red Cross ask Canada to be the champion, the representative of this cause?
No, well, he must have known Jim Battleman, and he wanted to talk to me about it. He didn't ask, not because he did not come all the way from Geneva to talk to me about it. He happened to be here, and we discussed about it. And it's just the way we began to be interested. It's really one of the things I like most of my career, when you start something important. Mr. Axworthy, because of his work on landmines, was even nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. It all started in 1995. But we have to give some credit to André Ouellette also, who worked on the project during the time he was the responsible minister. It became a priority for my government, and for me personally as well.
So it is a decision because you have invested a lot of time for this project. You've decided that this was...
Yes, I talked about it a lot. At a certain point, the thing that was shaken Putin, Yeltsin, is that Mr. Yeltsin had lost his fingers of the left hand because of a stick of dynamite in his youth. So I was trying to convince them. I said, listen, we were here. We are stupid enough to have wars, fine. But when the war is over, it should be over for good. But for young people or civilians to explode because of bombs and landmines placed there during wars, it's dangerous. And I said, you know, Mr. Yeltsin, children playing in the fields, they can explode, lose a leg, or lose their fingers. And then, he said, after he had shown me the guys of the Home Defense, he said, these guys don't want me to sign. But if Clinton signs, I'll sign. I didn't succeed. We cannot always achieve everything we want to do.
Another strong moment is the Kyoto Protocol. That's another long journey. How did you feel living it? How did it become a cause for Canada?
Well, first of all, there were a lot of people in my caucus who wanted us to sign it. On the other hand, there were a lot of people in the business world who did not want us to sign it. And during the negotiations, everyone was telling me not to sign the agreement because we will never be able to reach the, let's say we had a quota of 100. To get to 100, they would say, we cannot make it. Well, I said to myself that if we can reach 98 instead of 100, it's still much better than 0. And I decided right there, and I went to a conference on the issue, and I had the opinion of the cabinet. But we did not have... Many people accused me of having decided alone. But in fact, it is the Prime Minister who decides in a government. The ministers do as they're told, and if they're not happy, they have the leisure to resign. But that doesn't happen very often. So I said yes to Kyoto, because I believe, and if at the time we would have negotiated an agreement on petrol and the representatives of the petrol industry had signed at that time, those conditions would have been more lenient than the conditions set in the future. Too bad for them. They had an opportunity. I'm happy to have been able to do that, but it has been abandoned by Harper.
On an international scale, how much time did this involve? What does it imply? Do you spend much time on convincing others? I'm trying to understand.
These days, a prime minister is very involved internationally because they have a lot of meetings. There are all sorts of... There's the UN, NATO, the APEC, there's the G8, the G20. So you spend a lot of time on meetings like that. And it's very useful, in my opinion, because it allows us to know each other. And you know, I've met the president of China 17 times. It was quite a story. Mr. Trudeau met him once, and he traveled there before all the others. And he kept a good memory of it. I was there about 3 weeks ago, and the Prime Minister received me. Every time I visit China, I'm greeted by the President or the Prime Minister. Apparently, the former Prime Minister had lots of trouble with them, but I don't. We'll discuss that another time.
Thank you.
And that's it. Those meetings are very important. But you absolutely have to be ready to face discussions, to be aware of the issues. And it's very important for the Prime Minister to do well.
A Prime Minister, by definition, is a busy man. It has an agenda, a complicated time schedule. So, to take responsibility and say, I'll be the defender of landmines, I'll be champion of Kyoto, it's a voluntary act, because you then have to remove things from your agenda. You must give yourself some time to do it.
You know, it goes with this type of work. If you love your work, the more there is, the better. For me, firstly, to be successful, the trick is not to watch the news at night. If you don't watch the news, you sleep well, and you're able to work the next morning. You must be able to sleep and rest. The other important element is to trust your ministers. If you trust your ministers, they actually do the job for you. If you must direct everything, well, that's too much. I'm now thinking of Miss Copps, who has worked for me for a very long time. She was leading her ministry, as I've told my ministers on the first meeting, do your job. I'm giving you one responsibility, and I don't like to be bothered. Because I remember Trudeau. I have told them the story with Trudeau. Trudeau has said, you've not bothered me for a year. So this is what happened to me. I haven't disturbed him for a whole year. Then he appointed me president of the Treasury Board, Minister of Industry and Trade, Minister of Finance, Minister of Justice. You see what happens to a guy who does his job? So, Ms. Copps was there when I said that. So they were doing their job. They were able to delegate, but obviously they kept me informed of what was happening, and when they had problems, they spoke with either Mr. Pelche or the clerk. They were very reluctant to come to see me. They settled their problems. You know, a minister is the person who is responsible. I'd been minister myself. And Mr. Trudeau let me lead my ministry, and that's why I had success. So I had the same mindset. But as a prime minister, you have a big advantage over the ministers. You can sack them. If she does not do the work, you appoint another. Then I told them, you know, there's a B team back there. There are many men and women who are waiting to take your place. Don't worry, I'll be able to replace you. Nobody is irreplaceable, not even the prime minister.
What did you once tell me? If you're wrong once, I will support you. But if you're wrong too often, I'll replace you. Is that it?
Yes. Well, yes. That is what happened. Then you have, it's part of our system. You have to reshuffle. Because our system is different than the other ones. Ministers are MPs, and that makes two categories of parliamentarians, those who become ministers and those who don't. And I invite you to read the book that was just published by Bill Graham. Him, I have not appointed as a minister. He was a professor of international law who had, for all sorts of reasons, I've not appointed him minister. And he became the president of the International Relations Committee. And I read his book. And it's amazing to see the amount of work he could do, the contacts he was able to establish. And when I named him foreign minister for the last 2 years of my career, he was ready. But even if he did not become a minister at the end, he proved what an MP can do if he really wants to work. I remember there was a man called Blenkhorn. He was not the most pleasant of deputies, but he was a hard worker. And he became the chairman of the Finance Committee in the time of Mr. Mulroney. He had more influence than 3/4 of the Toronto office because he was doing his job. He was knowledgeable and familiar with all his files. He was not a minister, but he was more influential than a minister. This is what we often forget. A guy who had tremendous influence on me was Charles Cassia. And with great regret, I did not appoint him minister. He was the minister of Trudeau. But me, they called me yesterday's man, and this man was older than I was. So I didn't want to appoint him. He had great influence on me. Because when he arrived on Wednesday to attend the caucus, he came through the side door, and he always gave me a note that I read. Not aloud, but I read it, and then I did this. Phone me. He had an influence on me. He was the extreme left within the Liberal Party, and it was a guy who sometimes went too far. But when a decision was made, he defended that decision. But to get there, Charles could sometimes be very difficult, and he was a backbencher who had tremendous influence on me when I was Prime Minister.
So in addition to your achievements, you've also made history for something you've not done: sending Canadian troops to Iraq. The pressure must have been tremendous. George W. Bush, Tony Blair wanted you to be in the coalition of the willing.
Yes, that's for sure. Well, firstly, they were sure I was going to support them. That's what saved me, because they thought it wasn't worth it to... It's Bush's secretary who told me that. He said, "We were sure that you would be supporting us." And then he said, "But you had told us. We just didn't believe you." I have told them since the very beginning. In the month of August, in a meeting in Detroit, Bush has asked to see me one-on-one. He set aside an hour and a half to see me. And Condoleezza Rice was very angry because she wasn't supposed to. It was only me meeting with him. Neither my minister nor my foreign secretary did participate. So it didn't last very long. I said, listen, George, in Canada, we go into these sorts of things when we are supported by the United Nations or NATO. We have obligations towards NATO, and we respect them. And if you get the consent of the United Nations, we will be there. But I said, to get the United Nations consent, you must have better evidence than what you have for weapons of mass destruction. Well, he said, I will send you someone from Washington to Ottawa to... No, we have our information services. We have the same information. I don't want it to be frowned upon, Americans coming to brief me. I want to be briefed by my own people. And we share a lot of information. Almost all the information we have with the United States, Great Britain, and Australia. We have a kind of international agreement where we assist and help each other. So I saw those documents, and I was not convinced that there were any weapons of mass destruction. I described it in my book as follows. I did not have enough evidence to convince the judge of the municipal court of Shawinigan. And I knew the judge very well. One must also understand, if you believe in something, you see what you want to see in events. It came to me one evening. I was at home, and I was reading these confidential documents instead of watching the news. That's what I usually did. So I was reading. And suddenly it said that there was a truck or two trucks that were leaving to go from point A to point B, carrying loads of mass destruction weapons. I thought there was something wrong. It's not right. If the report had said the furniture of the mother-in-law was being moved, it would have been all right. But why would they want us to know? This was a telephone interception. I thought it made no sense. I said, but if we want people to know, we'll make them believe that. And it was the same incident in the case of... Do you remember the presentation of Powell to the United Nations when he said there were trucks going back and forth? This is probably the same thing. If we want to believe in something, we think it is there. And there was absolutely nothing. Then the other thing is that Tony Blair actually applied more pressure than George. I was under the impression that Tony Blair must have told him, Canada is a colony. Don't worry about it. I'll take care of them. Little Chrétien. So Blair, he didn't give me arguments. He didn't give me arguments regarding the weapons of mass destruction. In South Africa, he told me, Jean, we have to get rid of Saddam Hussein. He is a terrible dictator. So I replied, listen, Tony, maybe it's the case, and there are several other dictators that I don't particularly like or that I hate. If we embark in this process of replacing every government we don't like, when will it stop? I thought maybe I'll be the next one on the list. So, and there I said, maybe we should handle another issue. We were there for the Commonwealth. I don't like Mugabe much, the president of Zimbabwe. Maybe we should, he was our neighbor. Perhaps we should deal with problems in the Commonwealth family first before trying to resolve problems in the Middle East. And then he said, but Jean, Mugabe and Saddam are not the same. I replied, sure, I know they're not the same. Mugabe has no oil. He did not like that.
But did this happen in Detroit?
Well, no. This is when I visited South Africa.
It happens in... No. I was just trying to recreate the timeline. So, with Bush, it was planned. But you meet Blair in South Africa by accident.
To finish the story with Bush, the discussion didn't last very long. We got along, Bush and me, because I liked sports, and he did too. So, we talked about the serious issues. We had an hour and a half. It took 15 or 20 minutes. Then we talked about baseball and football, our children, of normal life.
Well, what I wanted to say is, once they knew your decision, did they call you? Or did they just try lobbying randomly at international meetings?
Well, we do talk from time to time. There are all sorts of issues that need to be discussed by the President of the United States and the Prime Minister of Canada. We would meet from time to time. We would meet at the Summit of the Americas, for example. So we had several. We had many meetings where we talked about all kinds of issues that were not always on the agenda. And we solved problems. One example of a problem we had, and of which I like to talk about, is the time I solved the problem of Prince Edward Island's potatoes at the Summit of the Americas in Quebec, because Americans no longer wanted to purchase the potatoes from Prince Edward Island because they had found one or two, they had problems in Prince Edward Island. But the real objective was protectionism in the name of health. So when Bush came to visit, I solved the problem the following way. He took 5 meals with us, and potatoes from Prince Edward Island were always on the menu. So at the end I said, listen, you see, you're not dead and I'm not dead either. And the issue was resolved. There are so many things.
But isn't there any, how could I put it? Is there no threat? Like if you won't come to Iraq, we will do such and such, no?
Well, look, blackmail doesn't normally work at this level. We're mature enough to understand that we represent a country, and a country is not run by one person only. No, there were no threats. Canadian businessmen called my wife about it, and they asked her to convince me to change my mind, and I've requested they send me the list of goods and services that Americans bought from us that they didn't need. I'm still waiting for that list. Business is business, but in fact, they've continued to eat. Even if they said they wouldn't eat French fries anymore, they continued to eat it still, right?
They just called them differently.
Yeah.
I'd like to talk about China, of course, while we still have some time. Before talking about China itself, there's a story that I find marvelous. I would like you to tell us about it. You had journalists all around you, and they asked you if you were going to mention the issue of human rights in China just before leaving.
Well, I was going to China. I've been on a tour in the Maritimes, and I was in Shediac. I was really tired. So I was in the center of a scrum with the journalists, as we say. I was cornered, and they start to question me. You're going to China. I hope you bring up these issues with the Chinese. I said, listen, I'm going to China. You want me to tell the president of China, who rules over 1.3 billion people, what to do. But you don't want me to tell the premier of Saskatchewan what to do. Respect provincial jurisdictions and all this, because I was talking about it all the time. And in fact, I was the first head of state to actually make a speech on human rights in Peking University, Beijing, with students asking me questions. On another trip, I spoke of human rights with the Association of Judges of China in Shanghai. So people now don't remember, but it was something they knew, and I spoke to them about it all the time. Only, they know very well that, you can tell them. I told them every time, and they knew that I had an answer. And when, how is the president of China called again? When he came here, Jiang Zemin. I made him speak to the media. He never participated in press conferences. He didn't want to make press conferences. No problem. Just tell them what you tell me. I gave my little speech, he gave his little speech, and then I gave the questions to the journalists. And the guy who wrote the most against me, I don't remember his name, he was from the Globe and Mail. I gave him the floor. And he started to stutter when he had the opportunity to ask a question to the president of China. He asked a question, if I remember correctly, about the mobility of the population. The president answered and said that if we let every Chinese move, as in Canada, it would result in 20 million people moving to Shanghai in the space of 3 months. It's like welcoming 7 million additional residents in Toronto or 4 million new residents in Montreal in the space of 3 months. It creates different types of problems. Then he said, that's why China cannot allow the same mobility as Canadians have. Well, it makes sense. When we are obliged to manage 1,300,000,000 people, we only have 36 million. The other day I went to China. In a small province, 100 million residents. I don't even remember the name of the province.
It's true. The smallest...
They have problems that are slightly different than ours.
So what was the incentive that drove you to travel there 17 times?
Well, I was part of Team Canada. We went there twice with Team Canada. We went there with... the first time was in November 1994. That was the first time. We went there accompanied by 500 people, businessmen and all the premiers of the provinces, except Quebec, unfortunately. For the meetings after that, Bouchard came with me. Parizeau didn't want to travel with me. I don't know why. So, we went there. It all started with Team Canada. It worked out pretty well. We were selling CANDU reactors and all that. We were the first ones. Su Ronji says in one of his speeches, without reading his prepared text, that Canada is the best friend of China. I always thought that China will be a powerful weapon and that we complement each other. We have a huge territory with a lot of space. They don't have that. We also have resources they lack. We can help each other. Obviously, it's up to the Chinese to change their political system. Even if I wanted to be re-elected, I have no chance to win, and this is, the people survive with what they have. The China of 1994 and the China I have visited a few weeks ago is not the same country. It's not the same. I still remember the first trip. I was with a minister. They were not allowed to have televisions in those days. There were satellites hanging from the windows everywhere. I said, "Hey, that's illegal, sir." That was it.
So there was surely an economic incentive in the forefront.
Well, look, Mr. Trudeau was the first Western leader to open relations with China. He did this with my friend Mitchell Sharp at the time when I was still a minister. I believed this was a great thing done by our government. And Canada is a Pacific nation. We often forget that when we are here. But British Columbia is closer to China than to Australia. I foresaw that the future of the world was shifting towards the Pacific, because that's where the largest populations are, and that's where the money went. And I'm not only talking about China. The economy of India grew significantly. Oil and oil money is in the Middle East, and especially the eastern region of the Middle East. So I believed it was the future for a country like Canada. We couldn't only depend on the U.S. market, as we were back then. We had to diversify our economy.
So we were the first ones to go there. How did our allies react? The Americans, the English, the French.
About what?
Well, how did they react about the fact that we went
after
there?
seeing what Trudeau has done, the Americans, Nixon, did the same, and then the other countries also. It was a good example, and it was normal that a country with a population of 1.3 billion inhabitants could now claim that it was one of the foremost countries.
Many photos in your archive shows you with the media. We perceive a kind of complicity with the media. Does it really represent how you were with them at the time, or it political correctness from your part?
Listen, here in Canada, we have a system that I find very efficient. First of all, we politicians must be in the House of Commons 5 days a week. We must answer questions asked by the ministers and the Prime Minister daily. So I was always present at the question period. I loved the question period because it is an absolutely extraordinary exercise. People ask you questions and you must answer. You cannot say, "I'm not aware of the issue," because after a few weeks, people will think you know nothing. So you must respond even if you do not know the answer, and you have to try to look smart. It takes a lot of... I had the advantage of having been a minister in all departments, so I could anticipate problems and give an answer that would make sense. And in my case, it was a kind of exercise I used to love to do in a way, because it forced me to have some knowledge regarding all files. Even if my ministers led the ministries, I was obliged to answer in the House of Commons. And since I always had the courtesy to answer questions to party leaders myself, except rare exceptions, I sometimes had to stand there for 30 to 40 minutes. Sometimes I felt the heat, but most times it went well. We tend to ask our deputies for their opinion on how it went. We were all a bit insecure, but I had a great trick. When I wanted to know how well it went, do you know what I did? If it was humid, it meant I had trouble, and if it was dry, it was because I behaved well.
So what about the media? Did you feel the same with...
Media was the same. I used to meet them regularly, except that I didn't like it after the question period because they asked the questions that were already asked in the House of Commons. And there, in my mind, the ministers who were well prepared and answered the question should have the merit of being able to have their own answer in the news, not the one of a prime minister who went there to talk. Unless, of course, there is an emergency. But I had to meet them after the question period. I met with them after the period of each cabinet meeting. I met with them. Firstly, in my time, everyone knew when and where the cabinet meeting would take place. Journalists knew it ended at noon because my meetings always began at a certain time and ended at a certain time. So they didn't have to wait for anyone. And when I saw the press, well, I went to see them and answer the questions myself. It wasn't my staff who decided who was going to ask me questions. I did that myself. It was an enormous advantage. I was the one choosing. So if there was someone who made me angry, I looked at him and said, "The other one." Then he knew he fell to the bottom of my list. I didn't even have to say anything, and I liked it. They asked questions. And it was always happening in the front of the Prime Minister's office where the cabinet was held, next to the stairs. So when I've had enough, I just say, "Hello, boys and girls, I'm leaving for lunch now," and whoosh, I was out of there. So they couldn't, I didn't feel trapped, and I could finish the session whenever I wanted to. But I was pretty generous with my time. I liked it, and they were treating me, well, okay. Sometimes they criticized me, but you have to live with that. It's part of democracy. If they said Chrétien was there when he wasn't, I informed him, or I sent someone to inform him. If they said I wasn't intelligent, I thought, well, okay, it's a judgment. Sometimes I told them, if you're that smart, why don't you run? I don't do that too often, though. It's not very kind.
Well, we will also apply that system right now. Have a great summer, and Mr. Chrétien, thank you again for coming.